난 평생에 무엇이든 안 만들고 지낸 날이란 없다. 내 이제 곧 세상을 하직할 텐데 이거라도 남겨놔야지.
Pulgasari야. Kaiju as a film genre has been one of my favorites since a young age. Giant hulking metaphors that doom humanity as a result of our selfish actions. Kaiju represent things like the threat of annihilation, capitalism's effects on indigenous people free from its clutches, and the people's fight against tyranny. Generally in the West, we remember the big names, Godzilla, King Kong, maybe even Mothra or Radon if you're feeling spicy, but there's a whole world of kaiju films outside of what's popular, even plenty outside of Japan and the US. Today we tell a giant century-spanning story of imperialism, a lost media monster, and a kidnapped director making and remaking a hidden gem. This might make you rethink the entire genre of film. You may know the classics, but have you heard the tale of Pulgasari, the people's monster? The iron-devouring beast has lived in the shadows for a long time, but his origin point has more in common with the king of monsters than you'd expect. This is the story of Pulgasari, the people's monster. 1945. The end of World War II and the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Empire of Japan's conflict with the Allied forces in the Pacific and the Republic of China on Chinese soil came to a head on August 6, 1945, with the United States' use of atomic weaponry on the city of Hiroshima. An entire city, both an important supply town for the Empire of Japan and a place housing over 300,000 people, including civilians, was nearly destroyed in a day. 3 days later, Nagasaki, one of the Empire's biggest seaports, was also bombed with a nuclear weapon. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito finally surrendered. A scar that would never heal ripped across the Pacific. Although it did not begin or end in 1945, the Japanese would always remember the horrifying 8 days between the first bombing and the surrender, and the hard years after, the black rain that followed the bombing, the radiation poisoning, the civilian evacuations, the countless deaths. An inexcusable loss of human life, and one of the hardest decisions any human has ever made. This wasn't just the end of the war. Even with the dismantling of the German Nazi Party and the Italian Fascist Party, a weapon like that in anyone's hands could ultimately corrupt and ultimately destroy. Post-war Japan was still fearful. After many years of isolationism and subjecting other countries, they were at the mercy of the world, and especially the United States. But this war in the Pacific didn't start in 1941, with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. The origins of Imperial Japan's conflict crescendoing started all the way back in 1854 with the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. The shogunate was a military government ruled by both an emperor, a political leader, and a shogun, a military leader decided upon by the emperor. For years, Japan's central government enforced a strict isolationist policy, one that would be broken by the United States using what's now referred to as gunboat diplomacy. US President Millard Fillmore, seeing Japan as a strategic point for trade and supply, flexed the might of the US Navy to force the Tokugawa shogunate to open up the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to Americans. This action would unknowingly make the shogunate spiral. The samurai of the Tokugawa, unable to believe in the might of the shogun, turned to Emperor Komei, who famously made an order to expel the barbarians, the many foreigners pushing into Japan at the time. This would align the two most powerful domains, the Satsuma and Choshu domain, to overtake the shogun, putting all the power into the newly crowned Emperor Meiji in what is now known as the Meiji Restoration. Much government restructuring occurred during the Meiji Restoration, the dissolution of the shogunate, an abolition of domains, the removal of the oppressive class system, and the establishment of a military power that would spiral into colonialism. An unbeknownst side effect to the actions of the United States meddling in foreign affairs is it would create a nationalistic empire that a little under 90 years later would strike back against it. Although a centralized government without classes was good for the average Japanese citizen, it led to a rejection of the old and anything foreign, and a need to modernize and industrialize. The country's castles, once a physical representation of the power of the shogunate, were destroyed. The emperor also forcefully separated Buddhism and Shintoism, which used to formally be combined in Japan. This policy led to the conversion of any Buddhist temples and iconography into Shinto temples and iconography, eventually co-opting Shintoism as their state religion. But the empire's border-stretching aspirations really started when the Ryukyu Kingdom was annexed properly into the empire as Okinawa Prefecture. Okinawa's territory was also being claimed by the Qing dynasty at the time, which came to a head when the Ryukyu expedition to Taiwan resulted in 54 sailors being killed by the Qing. The empire invaded Taiwan in retaliation, cementing Okinawa as part of the empire. However, the rising tensions with the Qing dynasty over Taiwan and Korea would lead to the First Sino-Japanese War, creating an incredibly volatile relationship between China and Japan for the next 80 years. But what was happening in Korea? Then known as the Kingdom of Chosun, the kingdom that occupied the Korean peninsula was constantly in strife. Just a few years before the formation of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japanese daimyo Toyotomi Hideyoshi invaded Chosun with the intention of conquering it and eventually China. And this resulted in two wars, now known as the Imjin Wars, a set of wars that did not yet put Chosun under Japanese rule, but in their weakened state, the Ming dynasty from Manchuria invaded, leading to Chosun becoming a vassal state to China. Eventually the Ming dynasty fell, and China's central government transferred to the Qing dynasty. The Chosun kingdom entered a period of almost 2 centuries of peace, which would be interrupted not by the Qing and not by the Japanese, but by the French in the United States. In 1886, the French sent countless Catholic missionaries to Chosun in the Qing dynasty, which for a lot of reasons were ultimately rejected. Although this did not have the colonizing effect the French wanted, it opened up the door for the same diplomatic coercion the United States had done to the Tokugawa shogunate to happen to Chosun. Although the US's initial attacks on the Chosun kingdom would prove ineffective, the weakened coast of Chosun attacked against a Japanese survey ship, which attacked back, leading to heavy losses for the locals. The Chosun and the Empire of Japan would end up signing a treaty opening up ports to the empire, but the writing was on the wall for the Chosun. The empire would return soon. We return to the First Sino-Japanese War, a conflict between the Empire of Japan and the much larger Qing dynasty. Many of the Kingdom of Chosun's people resented their kingdom's excess taxation from the Qing dynasty, internal government corruption, and weakness compared to foreign powers. This culminated in a peasant revolt, a revolution that the last king of Chosun, King Gojong, would ultimately not be able to quell. King Gojong requested troops from the Qing dynasty, who sent 8,000 men to stop the revolt. The presence of Ming troops in the Chosun in the empire's eyes broke a convention between the empire and the Ming, set just 10 years ago, stating both countries would not place troops in the kingdom. The resulting war led to heavy Qing losses as they could not keep up with Japan's more modern military. The Qing signed a treaty, making Chosun Kingdom finally independent and ceding Taiwan, the Penghu Islands, and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan. Japan, losing the last resistance towards the Chosun, began pushing in immediately. The moment that would truly intertwine the empire and Chosun, leading to the fall of both, happened in 1895 with the death of Empress Myeongseong of the Chosun. King Gojong was seen as weak in his own country due to foreign powers like the French, US, and Empire of Japan's influence. His wife, the Empress, had opposed Japanese expansion to Chosun and had a lot of political clout at the time. As she began reaching out to the Qing dynasty to the south and the Russian empires to the north, the Empire of Japan sent a small team led by Viscount Miyagoro to assassinate her. As other major figures who opposed the Japanese were killed, King Gojong fled to the Russian legation in the capital in the hopes that the Japanese would not kill him in a Russian diplomatic office. King Gojong, and the last bastion of hope against the foreign powers pressing into Chosun, began the Kwangmu Reform, rapidly modernizing Korea's technology, education system, and healthcare while expanding its military massively. He also officially established the short-lived Empire of Korea in order to hopefully resist the oncoming Japanese invasion. Japan's interest in Manchuria and Korea led to the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. Japan won, but suffered great losses. Not so long after the war, US President William Taft and Japan Imperial Prime Minister Count Katsurataro signed a thin secret agreement declaring Japan would 1. Not pursue the Philippines, a new US territory after the Spanish-American War, and 2. Enter a protectorate state for Korea, ensuring no more wars would happen over the country. Despite Emperor Gojong's best attempts at keeping Korea independent, having no more Western support and the end of the Russo-Japanese War led to the Prime Minister of Korea and many of the other ministers signing a treaty behind the emperor's back, officially declaring Japan the Protectorate of Korea. The Prime Minister's actions undermined the Emperor's resistance to Japanese influence, so the Emperor in turn secretly reached out to the Russian Empire, German Empire, and the United Kingdom, pleading for assistance. The Japanese Empire, upon learning this, abdicated Emperor Gojong, ascending his son, Emperor Sunjong, as the last Emperor of Korea. Just 3 years later, the Empire of Korea would be annexed into the Empire of Japan as Chosen, just as the Empire had done to the Ainu of Hokkaido and the Ryukyus of Okinawa. The people of Chosen were forced to assimilate to Japanese culture and society. Their land was taken, their government was reformed, culminating in the decision to force Koreans to take Japanese names in 1939. Everything was taken from Chosen, and Japan's colonizing efforts eventually culminated in their alliance with the Nazi Party in Germany and the Fascist Party of Italy, kicking off World War II. After 35 long years under forced cultural assimilation by the Japanese, Korea would finally be free from Japan in 1945 with the Emperor's surrender after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Near the end of the war, the United Nations had already been mulling what would happen to Korea after the war. The country would be divided into two sides separated along the 38th parallel. South Korea would be influenced by the US to form a capitalistic democracy, while North Korea would be influenced by the Soviet Union to form a communist party led by Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was an anti-Japanese communist rebel soldier before World War II and joined the Soviet Red Army from 1942 to 1945. Il-sung was a powerful leader that would go on to establish a cult of personality in North Korea that persists to this day. However, Kim's ambitions didn't just stop at the social and economic changes of the newly established Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It was a unification of North and South Korea. North Korea quickly formed the Korean People's Army and prepared to go to war. Joseph Stalin had initially declined assisting a North Korean invasion of South Korea, but the newly formed People's Republic of China, headed by Mao Zedong, sending troops made Stalin reconsider. Just 5 years after the liberation of Korea, the two Koreas had begun war with each other. The North backed by the Soviets and the Chinese, and the South backed by the United Nations and the United States. Despite a swift capture of South Korea's capital city of Seoul by the North Koreans, the US and South Korean troops eventually pushed back the North all the way to their own capital of Pyongyang until it was taken by the Chinese. This war led to a 2-year-long stalemate until a ceasefire was declared in 1953. Back over in Japan, post-war Japan was heavily shaped by the United States. Just like South Korea, it had become a capitalistic democracy. However, unlike South Korea, with no direct competition to its territories, Japan massively expanded economically by rebuilding its industries, getting into car, tool, ship, and electronics manufacturing. With the war over and money returning to the working class's pockets, an explosion of the arts happened. Manga, classic arts, music, and film in Japan had a renaissance, eventually gaining worldwide attention. In a few short years, Japanese filmmakers got to see many imported American films, began to make films of their own with their own unique cultural influences. In less than a year, we had already had some of the greats of film: Masaki Kobayashi, Akira Kurosawa, and most important to today's story, Ishiro Honda. Honda went on to direct one of the most important films of all time, establishing an entire genre and breaking into the international film market. But he started as a film student in Nihon University's film department in 1931. The department at the time was a disorganized mess and classes were often canceled. However, Honda took every chance he could to watch films in theaters, watching Frank Capra, Buster Keaton, and Charlie Chaplin films. He had worked at photographic chemical labs on a single film as assistant director before being drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. Honda worked on and off for photographic chemical labs and the Imperial Japanese Army throughout the 1930s, eventually returning briefly in 1942 to PCL, which had rebranded as Toho, where he and other staff were forced to work on propaganda films by the Japanese government. In 1944, the army shipped him off again, this time to China, where he was imprisoned by the Chinese National Army. When the war drew to an end, Honda returned to Toho, where he immediately began work again as an assistant director on many films, most notably Akira Kurosawa's Stray Dogs, and starting his directorial debut with Ise Shima, a documentary film commissioned by locals in the Ise Shima region to drum up tourism. Ise Shima, the film, is now more widely known for being the first Japanese film to use underwater photography, igniting a love for special effects that would only deepen after meeting Eiji Tsuburaya while working on the 1953 film Eagle of the Pacific. Eiji Tsuburaya is arguably the most important special effects director of all time. He's now often referred to as the father of tokusatsu, a subgenre referring to film and television with intense usage of practical special effects. Tsuburaya and Honda were incredibly ambitious filmmakers hungry for their big break that they'd get very soon. In 1954, Tomoyuki Tanaka, a film producer for Toho, was working on the film In the Shadow of Glory, a co-production with the Indonesian studio Perfini, to be filmed in Jakarta until it was suddenly cancelled by Indonesian authorities. Tanaka, needing an idea for a film fast, wrote it an idea for a film inspired by the 1933 American movie King Kong and the recently released American film The Beast from 2000 Fathoms. Tanaka's idea was approved, and he recruited Tsuburaya and Honda to work on his film. None of the three men knew it at the time, but their movie, now titled Gojira, would become one of the most important films of all time, exploding tokusatsu filmmaking and properly inventing the Kaiju genre. Movies featuring giant monsters had existed, but a genre of it would not be cemented until 1954. Godzilla isn't just a film about a monster that is giant, it's about the entire history of Japan that we had just discussed. It's about uncertainty in the post-war era, but also the threat nuclear weaponry provides to all people in the world. A creature with no country, no loyalty, and no concern for humanity, born out of humanity's own fearful actions. The film is loss in coping, it's crying without tears. It's hope for a world where people look out for other people. It's a film about the lost souls of the Japanese, Ainu, Okinawans, Koreans, Chinese, Taiwanese, the Malaysians, the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Laotians, the Filipinos, the Burmese, the Singaporeans, and all the other people who died for a colonist state set off by Western powers. It's a tearful and terrifying film, and for a lot of reasons it was a smash hit, securing the careers of Honda, Tanaka, and Tsuburaya forever. After 7 years of releasing films primarily about World War II, Toho had 2 hits on their hands in 1954, with Honda and Tsuburaya's Godzilla and Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Kurosawa was primarily known for his jidaigeki, period pieces set before the Meiji Restoration. While Tsuburaya, after essentially solidifying a new film genre from scratch, for the next 15 years would continue developing kaiju film special effects. But during 1963, he developed his own company, Tsuburaya Productions, which would develop Ultra Q, a kaiju television show that would cement itself with its own successful sequel series, Ultraman. Honda had a much immediately less clear career path. He had some successful post-war films for Toho, like An Echo Calls You, but unlike his peers, he wasn't interested in making jidaigeki, nor was he frequently working on new Godzilla films. He was, however, developing some highly experimental kaiju films at the time, Varan the Unbelievable, Rodan, and the Mysterians. Although he returned to Godzilla in the 1960s, he took some very interesting detours, especially with one of my favorites, Mothra 1961, a film about American capitalism and Japanese indifference to the cultures of the people of the Pacific, ironically portrayed in a decently offensive way. Kaiju films at the time were hot and seemed like a great path for film markets. The United States returns to the idea alongside many European attempts, but in the burgeoning film industry of South Korea, a new monster would be born to contend with the king of monsters, an iron-eating beast from before the Choson Kingdom, Bulgasari. After the Korean War, South Korea's economy was given time to heal and grow, and great art was made as a result. In 1955, their film industry entered their golden age, not too dissimilar from the US's own golden age of Hollywood. Films like Kim Ki-young's The Housemaid were making waves locally, while the country even got its first international film prize with Kang Dae-jin's The Coachman at Berlin International Film Festival. Unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, it was an insular market that wouldn't succeed internationally for many years. However, the many domestic dramas flooding the theaters in the 1950s led to a largely successful period of artistically fulfilling films free from government censorship. This would end with the election of President Park Chung-hee, who had put into effect the Motion Picture Law of 1962, which dramatically limits the subject of films. Just as the United States was slowly exiting the McCarthy era, South Korea would be entering its own, rejecting unpatriotic films with values determined communist by its government. The restrictions of these laws increased over time, ironically making for a film market more similar to the same communist countries the law was rejecting. The inverse effect of the motion picture law was that South Korea was heavily restricting incoming foreign films, meaning the competition in the domestic film market was much lighter. Because of this, film studios were producing tons of films, expanding into genres South Korea was not yet known for: animation, science fiction, and even kaiju films. Bulgasari, or Boeitai the End of Songdo, is a fascinating film. It's almost remarkable in its lack of remarkability. It is one of the many lost films from this era that seems to be lost due to its own terribleness. Film is a medium with tons of lost media, and in the impenetrable South Korean film market, your art could die a lonely death. Only the people who managed to see a film like this in theaters would ever see it. There's never been a home release or even another screening of Pulgasari. All the information we have on this film is from the Korean Film Archive, denoting production from Kwansung Films and direction from Kim Young-jae, both of which are difficult to research in English language sites. Kwansung Films seems to only lead back to Bulgasari, which might mean it was the production studio's only film. What's more puzzling is this is Kim Young-jae's directorial debut and only film directed, with Kim's career predominantly consisting of cinematography credits from the early 50s to the late 60s. Pulgasari even stars two prominent Korean actors of their time. We know Pulgasari exists, we know who made it, and we know it was really bad, with local newspapers calling the special effects unconvincing. If I sound like I overblown my praise of AJ Tsuburaya earlier, I want to be straight with you. It was very difficult to create convincing special effects at the time on the caliber of even the original 1954 Godzilla. King Kong and the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, the two films that inspired Godzilla, are not nearly as convincing as Godzilla 1954. Hell, I'd argue it took a while for Godzilla to look as good as the original Godzilla film. Pulgasari came out in 1962, predating any other kaiju films to be released in South Korea by 5 years. The next two South Korean films in the genre, Space Monster Wong Mag-wai and Yongri Monster of the Deep, did get wide releases. You can actually get both on Blu-ray. Yongri even had an international release by Toei. Yet all that exists of Pulgasari is 3 posters and some negative reviews. So let's talk about the monster Bulgasari. Bulgasari's name can mean impossible to kill, ironically a phrase homophonous with killed by fire. In the 1962 film Bulgasari, a martial artist in the Goryeo dynasty is murdered, but returns as Bulgasari. This description comes from the Korean Film Archive, but Bulgasari is actually based on a legendary beast from Korean folklore. A Buddhist monk created Bulgasari out of a small figure made of rice and grain and fed it needles till it grew. Buddhism was outlawed in Goryeo, and once the figure grew, eating more and more iron, it would seek revenge. Soldiers would try to kill it, but their blades only fed Bulgasari. Bulgasari grew to have an elephant's trunk, a bear's body, tiger claws, a rhino's eyes, and a bull's tail. The soldiers decide to burn Bulgasari, which despite its name has no effect. Still burning, he lights the local villages on fire. Depending on different stories' interpretations, Bulgasari may have been killed by other Buddhist monks or may still be alive. Either way, the 1962 film contradicts the legend a good amount. For one thing, the more human-like figure we see in the film's posters seem different from the folktales. And also, the monk who creates Bulgasari is interpreted as a martial artist who is killed by traitors to his country. This is merely speculation on a film that no longer exists, but my interpretation on Bulgasari 1962 is that it is probably a film edited heavily by the motion picture law, which would have been put into effect around that time that same year. The shrinking of the film market meant it was the best possible time to fill niche markets like the kaiju film market, which was previously full of Japanese exports. This, coupled with the government reinforcing pro-Korea films, meant that changing it from Goryeo-era Korea being a place unaccepting of people, to rebels being killed by an unkillable threat. Korean religious persecution is also probably not a topic that they'd like to touch, considering the much more recent religious persecution of Catholics in the Chosun era, but that gets into missionary work used as colonizing effort, and that's just a can of worms. But hey, that's just a theory. A Bulgasari theory. So, if you thought I had talked about 100 years of Japanese and Korean history to talk about a shitty film that doesn't exist, you wouldn't be right. You see, somehow despite Kwansung Films seemingly never making a movie again, Pulgasari had enough of an impact that it got a remake. While Bulgasari was getting made, another legendary filmmaker had come into prominence, the director Shin Sang-gok. As the golden era of Korean filmmaking went on, Shin directed multiple films a year. Just a year before Bulgasari, he created his own studio, Shin Films, and directed The House Guest and My Mother, the first South Korean film to be submitted to the Academy Awards, and ended up not being nominated that year. Shin Sang-gok's films Def Sum Young and Rice would also be submitted but not nominated. However, it proves one thing. Whereas Bulgasari's defining trait is its failure, Shin Sang-gok's defining trait was its success, a trait which would soon change as Park Chung-hee's restrictions in the film industry got tighter and tighter. Shin's films weren't very patriotic. Films like Rice proved that he thinks the function of the government is to serve its people and not the other way around. The South Korean government at the time was strict. A man like Park Chung-hee fears the day that Kim Jong-il returns to unite Korea and was perfectly fine with culture taking a backseat to the ability to fight for your country. After increasing restrictions by the government, Shin Films was shut down outright in 1978. Shin's luck in his home country's film industry had run out, but his ex-wife was a different story. Choi Eun-hee was a South Korean film actress who was prominently featured in many of Shin's films. The two got married but later divorced in 1976, when he had fathered 2 children with another major South Korean film actress, Oh Soo-mi. Just 2 years later, she would receive an offer to direct a film in Hong Kong. However, this was a trap, a ploy to get her out of Korea. There she would be kidnapped under order of Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il is the man we now know as North Korea's second supreme leader and son of Kim Il-sung. At the time of Choi Eun-hee's capture, he was the chief of North Korea's propaganda and agitation department. He saw a future in using culture as a form of control that previous Soviet imperial filmmakers did not. He tried directing many films but didn't seem to really understand the process of creating movies. Although Kim loved the medium of film, he was not a strong director, and his cast and crew were not very passionate about the films they made. So his idea was to get some outside perspective from South Korea, starting with Choi Eun-hee. Choi's disappearance led to Shin Sung-guk looking for her and eventually getting kidnapped himself. The pair would be in captivity from 1983 to 1986 and produced 7 films for Kim during that time. Kim was really hoping that they would revolutionize the North Korean film industry. Apparently, he went as far as making the two review 4 films a day, both domestic and foreign, during that time. Your letterbox looks shit compared to theirs. The films produced by the two were primarily propaganda in their themes and stories, but Shin and Choi brought an air of respect to the films. But ironically, just like Japanese films in the 1950s, the North Korean film market lacked genre diversity, being mostly period pieces and dramas. However, one foreign film had caught their eye for a direction to go next, Godzilla in 1984. From 1954 all the way until 1975, Godzilla had starred in 15 films under Toho, ending in Ishiro Honda's final film directed, Terror of Mechagodzilla. With Honda no longer directing, the series took a brief hiatus from feature films for 9 years while cooking up the next era of films, starting with Koji Hashimoto's Godzilla, or The Return of Godzilla in 1984. Late Showa era Godzilla by the end was getting really silly and far from the terror of the original 1954 film. This reboot served to wipe the slate clean of every previous film and serve as a direct sequel to the original film. The movie did generally well financially, despite being more expensive than any previous Godzilla film. Just like the first film, it had an American remake called Godzilla 1985, which is now known best for its intrusive Dr. Pepper advertisements.
We're doomed!
Godzilla would go dormant again until 1989's Godzilla vs. Biollante. However, the team at Toho would be assisting on a different monster, Pulgasari, Shin Sung-guk's final North Korean film. Perhaps the only film worked on by North Korean, Japanese, and Chinese studios, and now the poster child of the North Korean film industry. Kim Myung-jae's 1962 Bulgasari film died a quiet death, but apparently remained dormant on the shelves of Kim Jong-il until the reboot of Godzilla. The impact of Kaiju on the Korean film industry at the time was negligible. Godzilla was a figure Koreans knew, but it wasn't their monster. Kim Jong-il wanted Pulgasari to be their monster. Shin Sung-guk is a talented filmmaker with no passion for Kaiju films. It's obvious if you see this movie. However, Kim Jong-il seems really into Kaiju. He spoke very highly of Godzilla and may have been the sole owner to a copy of the original Bulgasari in 1962. This passion becomes obvious when he hired the professionals, commissioning Toho's Tokusatsu department to assist on this film, including Teruyoshi Nakano, the special effects director for several Godzilla films, and Kenpachiro Satsuma, the suit actor for Godzilla in the 1984 film. Pulgasari is a fascinating film. It's clearly a passion project from the man who would become supreme leader of North Korea, commissioning the studio that defined the Kaiju genre, and even going so far as to film some scenes in Beijing. Despite reportedly being finished in 1985, the film wouldn't be shown until January 1986 at Toho Studios, and wouldn't be released to the public until later that same year. Emphasis on would, as after the film had wrapped, Shin Sung-guk and Choi Eun-hee would escape North Korea. Kim Jong-il was reportedly impressed by Pulgasari, enough that he would give the two the freedom to go to Vienna, Austria with bodyguards to find a financier for Kim's next passion project, a biographical film on Genghis Khan. The pair convinced the bodyguards to step outside so they could have an interview and ran away to the US Embassy, where they were granted asylum. All of Shin Sung-guk's films were now banned from North Korea, including the now unreleased Pulgasari. However, 12 years later in 1998, Pulgasari would have a wide release in Japan, where it was commercially and critically successful. It was reviewed favorably compared to the Matthew Broderick American Godzilla film. So, unlike the original Pulgasari, the 1985 version is not lost media. We can actually watch it. So how was Pulgasari? I have good news for a person who got this far into the video. Pulgasari is good. Not ironically good, not good with a bunch of asterisks, it's just a very solid kaiju film. A lot of critics in the 90s compared it favorably, calling it a throwback to Showa-era Toho kaiju, and I couldn't agree more. Pulgasari is tokusatsu at its purest. The swords sound very Kamen Rider, the effects are passable but a little goofy, and no matter how silly the story gets, it takes itself 100% serious the entire time. Pulgasari feels like a lost 1970s Toho flick, and I mean that with tons of love and respect for this thing. This interpretation of Pulgasari is a lot closer to the folktale, with the iron-eating beast being a figure made of rice by an imprisoned village blacksmith who refused to melt down the cooking utensils and farming tools to make weapons for the local governor. With his last bit of life, he gives wills to the figure, which he calls Pulgasari. His son and daughter obtain the lifeless figure, the last remnant of their father, and when his daughter Amy believes in Pulgasari, it springs to life, eating the family's needles. You can see now that Pulgasari feels a lot like a composite of a lot of Toho kaiju films from the Showa era. It resembles Godzilla, but evolves over time like Mothra, and its small form looks similar to Manila. The tiny figure continues eating iron until it's the size of a child, and saves Inde, Amy's lover and leader of the forces rebelling against the king of Goryo, by literally eating the sword of one of the king's men. The king's army is fearful of Pulgasari, even though he's just a little guy, and those fears end up becoming completely based in reality when Pulgasari eats enough iron to become the size of an adult man. They do not hide that it's just a suit actor here, and honestly just reminds me of a lot of Sentai series from the 1980s. Pulgasari helps the rebel army defeating the governor's forces and becoming a proper-sized kaiju. Now moving on to the king's palace. The king's general begins resorting to what I can only describe as Tom and Jerry tactics to kill Pulgasari. Seriously, if you wanted a film from the perspective of a kaiju who has to experience something like the oxygen destroyer from Godzilla, or the balloon trap thing from Godzilla -1, this is the movie. The general ends up stopping him by digging a giant hole and having a local priestess attempt to exorcise the blacksmith spirit from Pulgasari and then fill the hole with rocks as he falls in. Despite how convoluted the plan is, it actually works, so the rebel army cook up something just as complicated to get Pulgasari back. Amy disguises herself as one of the women following the general's army, wins a persuade check, and cuts herself directly above the rocks that buried Pulgasari. The blood brings Pulgasari back to life, defeating the army and forcing them all the way back into the castle. The Imperial Palace scenes were the bits that were shot in Beijing, and it really goes to show as they just look completely different. Pulgasari makes it to the Imperial Palace where the king has one final trick up his sleeve. 2 cannons. It's literally just 2 cannons. Pulgasari ends up spitting the cannonballs back at the capital and ends the war, killing the general. What comes next is a played straight scene of Pulgasari slowly walking over to the carrying king, who hides himself in a cloth before being crushed by Pulgasari. A lesser film would end there, but this film had a consideration. A huge beast that eats iron would need more to eat, and although the people are thankful for Pulgasari, they can't feed them their cooking utensils and farming equipment. He's now become the problem that the people wanted to fix. So Amy rings the bell of her local village to lure the beast over, hides in the bell, and allows him to eat her. This allows Amy's spirit to speak directly to Pulgasari. She tells him the people are grateful for him, but he can't keep eating their iron, or he will just continue to be used as a tool for war. He ends up giving his life to bring Amy back, and the film ends on her lifeless body, still yet to awake. This is a damn fun film that probably would have been a smash hit in North Korea if it had been released. It's a good deal better than a lot of its Toho contemporaries. It has solid acting and a banging soundtrack. However, I generally would not recommend it as your first kaiju film or even your second. It's a deep genre cut film. I would say to watch some of the classics or even some bad kaiju film to have an idea of how surprisingly solid this movie is. If you're good with a campy, fun kaiju film with some obvious allegories for real-life rebels who become terrible despots that repeat the same cycles of greed unless checked by the people, the iron-eating beast may be for you. So, if you thought I talked about 120 years of Japanese and Korean history to talk about a good fun movie that exists, you still wouldn't be right. Bulgasari isn't a duology of films, it's a trilogy. Let me introduce Sean McNamara's Galgameth. Sean McNamara is the film and television director best known for, I don't know, Even Stevens, Zeke and Luther, the Sweet Life on Deck movie, the Ronald Reagan biopic. But before Sean McNamara worked for the Disney Channel, he had worked on a loose adaptation of Pulgasari called Galgameth with Shin-Chan. Most kaiju films are surprisingly family-friendly, but Galgameth is in the niches of niches. Children's kaiju films? Galgameth is a baffling movie. Shin-Chan has gone on record saying he's not a fan of the genre, but decided to produce this American remake thing of his last movie that he made in North Korea 10 years later. This is a real film, written by Michael Angeli, the writer of Battlestar Galactica and Monk. Galgameth is actually played by Doug fucking Jones. At a budget of $10 million US, this even predates the first fully American Godzilla movie by 2 years, coming out in 1996. So, this is a movie that exists. Let's review Galgameth. Galgameth is in a lot of ways a family-friendly rehash of the plot of Pulgasari, but worse in almost every single way. Galgameth is the story of Prince Davin, a young prince who becomes king of the country of Donegold, after his father is poisoned by his advisor, LL, for not invading the peaceful neighboring kingdom of Lovania. In Davin's grief, LL rules the kingdom in everything but name. He has the king's army invade Lovania. Before Davin's father's death, he gave him a figure reflected in their family's crests that he called Galgameth. As Davin cries into Galgameth, the figure comes to life and begins eating iron in Davin's room. In Pulgasari, the tiny Pulgasari doesn't stay small for very long, but Galgameth stays tiny for child-friendly hijinks. Davin even gives him a nickname, Galgi, which isn't very cute, but it's what everyone will call him for the rest of the movie. Galgi especially hates blackbirds and chases them away when he sees them. This somehow becomes a linchpin between the two's relationship. Davin and Galgi find out that LL is planning to dispose of them and are sent to a Lovanian prison where they escape through comical hijinks. Davin and a now child-sized Galgi take refuge in a Lovanian inn. Davin and Galgi disguise themselves to hide from the Donegoldian Knights, but learn that the people of Lovania hate King Davin because they think that he's the one ordering the invasion of their kingdom. Here we form the core group of rebels that will fight LL and his troops. Davin lying about his identity, Galgi, obligatory love interest, Periel, and two boring guys that I for the life of me could not remember, but one of them is voiced by Invader Zim.
I'd swap a date with the chopping block just to skin the little coward alive. I would.
Yeah.
If you were thinking, how is this a remake of Pulgasari and anything other than the monster, here's where Shin-Chan started copying his own homework. LL has his strategician Ji-Dao come up with a plan to kill Galgameth. Ji-Dao's first idea was to trap him and burn him alive. This plan backfires terribly as Galgameth is immune to fire, and gets the chance to eat even more iron, becoming even larger. The Lovanian rebels deliberate on whether to feed Galgameth their remaining weapons to make him strong enough to give them a fighting chance, and ultimately decide that the strength of Galgameth is more important than their own weapons. The Lovanians march farther into the borders of Donegold, where they encounter an ambush where Galgameth is covered in rocks. They retreat, losing Galgameth. Ji-Dao reveals to LL the next of his plans, a strong cannon to help prevent the rebels from reaching the capital. This might sound familiar, but I will also give Sean McNamara this. The cannon in Galgameth is a lot stronger. They showed it off by trying it out in a Lovanian village that gets completely demolished. Davin decides to return to Galgameth to unbury him, where Donegoldian Knights try to stop him.
Drop your rocks, boy! By order of His Highness LL, you're under arrest! Did you hear me? Boy!
The boy continues to dig up Galgameth when he's saved by the Lovanians, who now know that he's King Davin. They decide to align with Davin as long as his troops withdraw from Lovania. He agrees and they reconcile, but LL and Ji-Dao shoot their cannon in their direction, forcing them to hide. Davin decides to get Galgameth up the only way he can, by reminding him of those fucking birds he hates.
Blackbird. 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 Blackbird!
Blackbird! What the hell is Blackbird?
Galgameth is able to get up and begins to raid the castle of Donegold. He's able to withstand the fire from the cannon and even eats one of the fireballs. So just for reference, Galgameth can withstand fire and a cannon that can destroy a small village, but loses to rocks? Unable to stop Galgameth, LL kidnaps King Davin and goes to the coast, where he plans to send Davin out to a boat and burn that boat at sea. Periel and Galgameth find him, and Galgi walks directly into the water to save Davin, but ends up ending his own life. Day breaks, and LL washes up on shore, where him and Davin have a final joust that LL loses. Completely desperate, LL decides to just stab a child with a sword, and is stopped when Davin takes his sword out and stabs him directly in the chest, saving the kingdoms of Donegold and Lovania. Where I would say Pulgasari is better than I thought it would be, I would say that Galgameth was worse than I expected, and I thought it would be pretty bad. The effects work looked cheap and dated, and the action was hard to follow along with. And I know good child actors with good directors to bring out their talent doesn't happen often. Devin Otway as King Davin just doesn't work. It's funny when it's not trying to be funny, and unfunny when it's trying to be funny. Just a rough movie to watch, but I'm not going to be harder on it. It's a film without a streaming or Blu-ray release. It didn't even get pushed by a major film distributor. This concludes the 34-year history of Pulgasari. 3 films, each to die a different quiet death. One founded on history, blood, and iron. No one's returned to the concept recently, and we're still missing the South Korean film. If you have any information regarding its whereabouts, or even more unlikely of actually seeing it, please let me know in the comments down below. I know copies exist out there, and I'm very certain North Korea at least has a copy of it. Pulgasari has been a fascinating topic to research. Most major kaiju are informed by a philosophy, and Pulgasari's is resistant to tyrannical rule. The same iron creature that stopped the persecution of the Buddhists and slayed the king of Goryeo and did whatever that was in Galgameth. Pulgasari really is the monster of the people. If I have a request here, if you are a kaiju fan, I would highly recommend the 1985 Shin-Chan film. It is a genuine gem. It has no major distributors, so you should be able to see it on YouTube or the Internet Archive for free. Genuinely not sure what the rights currently are for it, but I'd love to own a physical copy of it if possible. Great monster, great soundtrack, great story. Shin-Chan died almost 20 years ago now, so it would be very nice to have his legacy actually cemented. And on that note, I've been Milk_OHK. This video has been a massive undertaking, plenty larger than every single essay I've previously made. So if you're interested in more content like this, a like and a subscribe go a long way for a small creator like me. I primarily cover older internet horror content, video games, and film. If you like this video, I'd recommend checking out my video on the creator of username 666 Pure Pito. But thank you all for watching, and have a good night.